Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about one of Toronto's lost interurban lines, that being the Metropolitan line. Now, before I get into the video, I just want to clarify that throughout the video, you'll hear me use the word radial and interurban interchangeably. And I just want to specify that those two things are the same. A radial and an interurban are the same thing. Radial is just a weird Canadianism. So, let's get into the video. The story of Toronto's first interurban begins in 1874 with the Scottish-born Robert Jaffray. Prior to getting into the rail business, he had found success in the retail space as a wholesale grocer. In 1874, he used his connections to the Federal Liberal Party to secure a spot on the Royal Commission of Inquiry on the Northern Railway of Canada. It was here he would see the potential of railway connections between Toronto and its neighbours. With this experience, he gathered a group of investors from the Toronto Street Railway and would use his connections to the Provincial Liberal Party to ease the passage of the Metropolitan Railway Act, which would allow for the establishment of the Metropolitan Street Railway, or MSR for short. The MSR would be formally incorporated on March 2, 1878, and had a capital stock of $100,000 in 1,000 shares at $100 each. The MSR was authorized to haul both passengers and freight outside the city, but was restricted to passenger-only operations within Toronto. Fares could not exceed 5 cents for the first 3 miles, 4.8 kilometers, with an additional 1 cent for each added mile, 1.6 kilometers. While all of this was set, it would still be 7 years before the company started running trains. In 1880, the brothers Charles and W.A. Warren would buy a controlling stake in the MSR, as like Robert Jaffray, they too had been looking to branch out from their wholesale grocery business. In 1881, Warren would propose running steam-powered cars down Yonge Street, but this was turned down by York County. 3 years later, the county would agree to the MSR using horse-drawn cars. On June 25, 1884, the MSR would be granted a 30-year operating charter to operate service along Yonge Street, north of the city limits. By this point, Toronto's northernmost limit was the CP railway tracks, as the old village of Yorkville had been annexed by the city of Toronto a year earlier in 1883. The specifics of the operating charter were as follows. The MSR would operate on a broad gauge railway on tracks of 4 feet 10 and 7/8 inches. Car speed on the line would be limited to 10 kilometers per hour with a minimum of 4 trips per day except Sundays. The MSR was also specifically charged with maintaining service through the winter, either by sleigh or by keeping the tracks clear of snow. Service on the Metropolitan line would finally begin on January 26, 1885, 7 years after the MSR was incorporated. The route would run along a single-track line off to the side of Yonge Street, running from the CP railway tracks to Eglinton Avenue in the village of Eglinton. The route was largely made up of flag stops, but had major stops at Farnham Avenue, St. Clair Avenue, Deer Park, and Davisville Avenue. Cars would be stored and maintained at a shed located in the northwest corner of what is today Mount Pleasant Cemetery. A year later in 1886, the Metropolitan line would be extended 1.6 kilometers north to Glen Grove Avenue, where Warren would open a new park and pleasure grounds on family-owned land. This park would become a focal point for residents along this part of Yonge Street and would help build ridership for the route. By this point, Warren was looking to upgrade the MSR to electric-powered cars, as he had been captivated by Charles Van Depole's electric trolley demonstrations at the exhibitions in 1884 and 1885. Warren believed that electrically powered cars would be better at climbing the steep Gallows Hill and Cemetery Hill than horse-drawn cars. Warren would look on with jealousy as other street railways around North America began to electrify, such as the Windsor Streetcar, which was the first streetcar network in Canada to electrify, and the St. Catharines, Meriton, and Thorold Street Railway, which became one of the first fully electric interurban lines in North America in 1887. In 1889, Warren would lead a delegation of MSR executives, investors, and councillors from York County to Pittsburgh to view electric suburban railway developments. Shortly after this, York County would approve the electrification of the Metropolitan line and a speed limit increase to 19 kilometers per hour. On September 1st, 1890, the MSR would trial its first electric car, and the Toronto Globe would report, "It was a very successful trip. Electricity will now be the mode of power north of the CP rail tracks." Electrical equipment would be installed by Thomas Houston of Boston, and 2 electric cars would be built by Lewis and Foster of New York. The MSR would begin generating its own power from a steam-driven powerhouse south of Davisville, and the Metropolitan line would begin electric service 2 years before the Toronto Railway Company would electrify Toronto's streetcar network. This switch from horsepower to electric power, however, may have been too quick, as the MSR would immediately encounter problems. The main issue was the heavier electric cars, which operated at higher speeds than horse-drawn cars, would loosen the rails along the line. The electric cars would even be withdrawn from service due to the frequency of broken rail bonds. The entire line would have to be rebuilt in the spring of 1891 with heavier rails, after which electric service was restarted. This rebuild may have also been when the route was re-gauged to standard gauge, although I can't find an exact answer for when this re-gauge occurred. Personally, this rebuild makes the most sense to me. In 1892, the Metropolitan line would be extended north to Melrose Avenue in the village of York Mills. Additional stops would be located at Glen Grove and Bedford Park. By the 1890s, the MSR's impact on the areas north of Toronto on Yonge Street had become apparent. In 1889, the village of Eglinton and Davisville merged to form the village of North Toronto with a population of about 700. In 1890, Bedford Park would join and North Toronto would become a town. Up until this point, Yonge Street north of Toronto was only partially gravel and only wide enough for 2 carriages to pass, with the bulk of it still being dirt. The MSR made proximity to Yonge Street valuable, and narrow, deep lots would become the norm along the street, occupied by residents and shops. Eventually, plank sidewalks would be installed along Yonge Street. By 1905, the town of North Toronto would have a population around 2,500, with a growth of about 500 people per year. Yonge Street would quickly become lined on either side by shops and homes from Merton Street to Bedford Park. Toronto historian David Beasley would state that by 1910, the once rural community was assuming the character of an almost exclusively residential suburb. Within the town, you could find mixed opinions about the MSR's service. Many liked the MSR as it gave them a quick way into Toronto with a transfer to the city's streetcars at the CP rail tracks. However, this transfer was a point of contention, as some such as the North Toronto Recorder decried the MSR as a monopoly that was preventing the Toronto Railway Company's expansion north, allowing for a one-seat, one-fare ride into Toronto. As well, the problems caused by the route's electrification in 1890 didn't help matters. However, opinions would improve after the MSR rebuilt its line with heavier rails and reintroduced electric service. In 1893, the MSR would receive provincial approval to extend its service north, and residents living in the northern areas of York County looked on at the MSR with great interest. Specifically, the Reeve of York Township St. Humberstone encouraged a northward expansion of the line, as one would have to travel all the way to Aurora before they would encounter a train station near Yonge Street at the time. Bringing the MSR north would help connect the communities north of York Mills and south of Aurora, which had no transit connections at all. The first order of business would be the construction of a 16-kilometer extension of the route into Richmond Hill. This would require passing the route through the Hogs Hollow Ravine, which would feature an 8% gradient, the second steepest of any North American interurban. The route would continue along the west side of Yonge Street to the Forest Lawn Mausoleum, where it would then cut across to the east side of the street. On October 26, 1896, just 48 hours after signing the contract with the county, the contractors Carrin and Hussey from Pittsburgh began construction of the extension, and at its peak between 300 and 400 men worked on the extension. Speed was of the essence, as Carrin and Hussey had promised to have this 16-kilometer extension completed in 1 month, by November 20th, barring accidents beyond their control. Construction of the extension nearly ground to a halt in its second week when workers south of Thornhill threatened to walk off the job, demanding an advance on wages. A construction superintendent would placate the workers by offering an immediate pay raise from $1 to $1.25 per day. The workers were satisfied and reportedly returned to work singing "He's a Jolly Good Fellow." Construction of the extension to Richmond Hill would finish on November 19th, with just 3 hours to spare before the November 20th deadline. Sort of. Between 9 and 10 o'clock in the evening, the first ever rail car into Richmond Hill arrived. However, it was a horse-drawn car. While the 16 kilometers of track had been successfully laid in only a month, there were still gaps in the catenary, meaning electric car service couldn't yet be provided. The residents of Richmond Hill, however, did not care, as they were glad to have a direct rail link into Toronto. Electrified service into Richmond Hill would not start until 3 months later on February 1st, 1897. As stated before, the extension would see the route extended 16 kilometers north to Lorne Avenue in Richmond Hill, with additional major stops at Forest Lawn Mausoleum, Bales, Lansing Post Office, Kingsdale Willowdale, Finch's Corners, Newtonbrook, Steele's Corners, Morgan's, Thornhill Village, Thornhill, Langstaff, Industrial Farm, Lot 40, and Mill Road. This extension would also feature a couple of sidings for freight service. There was a small siding north of Glen Echo to access the York Springs Waterworks, and another siding north of Kingsdale to access a lumber yard. The MSR operated 4 daily trips on this line to Richmond Hill with an average journey time of about 45 minutes. This was a massive increase in time saved compared to the pre-existing stagecoach service to Richmond Hill, which could take upwards of 3 hours. A single fare from the CP rail tracks to Richmond Hill was 45 cents and 65 cents for a return trip. By the end of the year, the MSR had replaced its old cars with new ones built by the Pullman Palace Car Company. The effects the MSR extension had on the surrounding areas was immediate, as residents in Richmond Hill flocked to the interurban and its significantly shorter travel time into the city. Now, residents along these far-flung areas of Yonge Street could travel into the city and other communities and not have to dedicate an entire day to the trip. The village of Richmond Hill would see a 35% increase in general trade and a slow but noticeable population increase from 629 to 741 between 1901 and 1911. The Toronto World newspaper would report, "One cannot help thinking that with the electric cars running, Richmond Hill will assume more the character of a suburb than an outlying country village." The York Gazette would report, "The villagers and farmers along the route have aroused from their peaceful humdrum lifestyle and acknowledge that the impossible has happened and that they will be able to make visits to the city without delaying the work on their farms by having to take a team away." The Richmond Hill extension also had an impact on the company, as its success had overshadowed the original line through North Toronto. The MSR was becoming more like a radial railway than a mere street railway, and as such, in 1897 the MSR would drop the word street from their name, becoming the Metropolitan Railway Company, or MRC for short. The MRC, however, was not content to just sit around, as it saw great value in further extensions north. The city streets of downtown Toronto were locked up by the Toronto Railway Company, but the hinterlands of York County and beyond was free real estate. The MRC would lean on its 1894 agreement with York County that would allow for the company to extend its service north to Lake Simcoe, with an exclusive 35-year operating franchise. This agreement also allowed for cars to operate at speeds of up to 32 kilometers per hour, and the MRC could charge a fare of 3 cents per mile. Back in 1895, the MRC would also get a slight boon to its service, as the provincial government passed legislation allowing the MRC to deliver milk into Toronto on Sundays, before 10 a.m. and after 5 p.m. 1897 would be an important year, as not only did electrified service to Richmond Hill start and the company changed its name, but it would also be given carte blanche by the province to build itself out however it pleased. Specifically, the province passed legislation allowing the MRC to build anywhere in York and Simcoe counties on gauges and motive power of its choice. It was also permitted to make agreements with other electric and steam train operators, running rights, and interchanges of cars. The big green cars of the Metropolitan Railway would roll into the village of Aurora in 1899. This extension would see the Metropolitan line extended 14.1 kilometers from Richmond Hill to Aurora, with additional major stops at Elgin Mills, Gamble's, Jefferson Post Office, Ryan's, Bond Lake, Oak Ridge's Post Office, Pinnacle, and Aurora Cemetery. This extension would also see the construction of the new Bond Lake Car House and Powerhouse, just south of Bond Lake, to store and power the MRC's fleet of cars. Lastly, a new siding would also be constructed south of Elgin Mills, connecting the MRC with the Canadian Northern Ontario James Bay Railway. The small village of Aurora would benefit from interurban service the same way Richmond Hill did, as up until this point the town had actually seen its population decrease as young residents moved to Toronto seeking better opportunities. The Metropolitan line would help increase business in the village, and like Richmond Hill, the village would see its population begin to increase in the early 1900s, from 1,590 in 1901 to 1,683 in 1911. Ultimately, the residents of Aurora embraced the new interurban line, with the Aurora banner giving the new line a truly unique form of praise after one of the cars ran over a local dog, stating, "It would be a good thing if half the dogs in the town were killed by the cars." The Metropolitan Railway was already looking at a further northern extension of the route into Newmarket, as the town of Newmarket had been making overtures about bringing the interurban to the town back in 1895. In 1898, the MRC made a formal request to the town council to lay tracks and produce and sell electricity. Newmarket Council agreed and would give the MRC a 10-year exemption on all property taxes. However, the extension into Newmarket would not be as straightforward as the extensions into Richmond Hill or Aurora, as Newmarket's downtown was not on Yonge Street. Instead, downtown Newmarket was located east of Yonge Street on Main Street, which presented itself as the narrowest and steepest main street on the line. In January of 1899, a contentious debate would kick off at a public meeting in Newmarket about whether or not tracks should be laid on Main Street. Opponents to the idea cited issues of horses being frightened by the cars along other parts of the route, and a concern for how this would play out on Newmarket's busy Main Street. Proponents of the project rejected these claims and touted the economic benefits the interurban would bring to the town. Ultimately, proponents of the plan would win out, and the Newmarket era would state, "If we aspire to be a country town, we must show reasonable convenience for increased traffic consequent of such a move." With approval from the town, the MRC would begin laying down tracks into Newmarket throughout the spring of 1899. This 6.7 kilometer extension would see the route extended north up Yonge Street to Mullock Drive. From there, it would turn east and run through what was at the time empty fields to Main Street. It would then run north to its terminus at Timothy Street. This extension would also include additional stops at Armitage Post Office and Mullock. The arrival of the Interurban to Newmarket was met with great fanfare, with the Newmarket era stating, "As the first trolley car came into sight around T.H. Brunton's Law, it was greeted with cheers which continued until it reached the end of the track at the waterworks. The car halted and congratulations were offered to Mr. Warren, president of the company, and Mr. Moyes, the manager, who in turn invited all who wished to take a free ride. Joyfully accepting, 75 citizens set off on the maiden trip, mid the cheers of those aboard as well as those left behind. The car proceeded as far as Aurora, and all spoke enthusiastically of the pleasure of riding in such comfort." The MRC would operate 5 trips a day between Toronto and Newmarket, with that increasing to 8 trips a day the next year. The fare for a return trip was $1.20. Newmarket would also see the benefits from the interurban line as new businesses opened and new lots for housing began to spring up west of Main Street between Niagara and Lorne Avenue. That September, the new trolley service brought an estimated 1,000 people to the town for the 3-day North York Agricultural Fair. Between 1901 and 1911, the town would see its population jump from 2,125 to 3,316 residents. Farming and agriculture in Newmarket would prosper, as the MRC's freight service would transport large quantities of locally produced butter and eggs to Toronto, and fresh fruit from Niagara into the town in the summer. However, underneath all of this was a simmering issue, as the concerns of those raised back at the public meeting earlier in the year would prove to be true. Wagon and buggy drivers would begin pulling off onto side streets and back lanes to protect their horses, who were frightened by the strange sounds the trolley cars made. As well, waiting passengers and freight cars would clog up Main Street for minutes or even hours in some cases. Instead of attracting people to Main Street, the Interurban was driving people away, and it had become clear the train could not stay on Main Street. The MRC had requested that Main Street be widened to accommodate the cars prior to construction, but the town council rejected this. By 1901, there was a push to reroute the Metropolitan line through Newmarket, and both the town council and the MRC saw value in this. For the town, this would free up space on Main Street, and for the MRC, it could offer an easier extension north to Lake Simcoe. The new route alignment would now see cars taken off of Main Street, and they would instead operate along various laneways to the west of Main Street. A new terminal would be built at Botsford Street across from the town hall. As well, a new freight car shed with a loading platform would be built immediately north of the station. This idea, however, was met with resistance, as some residents were outraged that tracks would be laid across their property. One historian would note, "One man at the south end of the town sat at the proposed crossing holding a shotgun and refused to permit passage of the railroad until the price asked was paid for." The new alignment into Newmarket would enter service in 1905. 1905 would also see the MRC add additional evening trips to the schedule, and now someone in Newmarket could head into the city at lunch and be back home by midnight. Let's take a break from the Metropolitan and make a diversion to a steam railway, the Schomberg and Aurora Railway, or S&AR for short. Trust me, this will make sense in the end. The S&AR was founded in 1896 by an entrepreneur named Benjamin Brown. Brown had acquired a federal charter to establish a railway line from the small village of Schomberg to a point between King City and Newmarket, likely around the Grand Trunk Railway tracks, today's GO Transit Barrie line. This charter would be changed to authorize an extension of the line to Bond Lake. Construction of this route started on July 26, 1899, but took a while due to financial issues. Since this railway was under a federal charter, it was given a $46,000 subsidy, but this wouldn't be enough as landowners along the line were asking for upwards of $500 per acre plus damages for severance. The S&AR would go to the King Township, seeking an additional $12,000 investment from the town to help build the line. This would turn out to be a contentious issue to some residents and farmers. An angry ratepayer would speak to the Newmarket era and state, "I cannot see that a railway through here will benefit the farmer to the tune of $1 per year. We will not get 1 cent per pound more for our produce than we will without the railway. The proposed railway is just to accommodate the people of Schomberg and Aurora. If they think a railway is needed and will be a paying investment, let them put it through and we will pay them whenever we see fit to use it." Ultimately, the King Township would vote in favor of granting the S&AR a $12,000 bonus to help construct the line. While the railway was under construction, anticipation would build along the route as real estate speculators began buying up land at $10 an acre for the construction of new subdivisions like Eversley and Aurora Gardens. The last spike would be driven at Schomberg on August 29, 1902, although service would not commence for another year, as the Grand Trunk Railway had removed its crossing with the S&AR, and this is an issue that would need to be resolved in the courts. The S&AR would run a 22.4 kilometer route from Oak Ridge to Schomberg, with the line starting in the east at an interchange with the Metropolitan line at Bond Crescent in Oak Ridge. The route would then meander through King Township to its western terminus in Schomberg at what is today the intersection of Dr. K Drive and Main Street. There would be major stops at Eversley and Kettleby. The railway also had numerous street-side whistle stops. The railway also had a private spur line that ran to Mary Lake to serve the summer estates of Henry Palat and the Eatons family. Lastly, there were a couple of spurs and sidings serving local farms along the route. The first steam train would enter Schomberg in 1903 to much adulation from local residents. The train would take a carload of people on a free ride to Aurora. While passing the Archibald Farm at the corner of 6th Concession and Lloydtown Aurora Road, local resident Mabel Mills stated that the train made so much noise that one of the Archibald Farm horses dropped dead from railway fright. Service on the route would operate twice daily with 3 trips on Wednesday market days. Trains would usually carry 1 or 2 passenger cars. Residents of Schomberg were delighted by the new service as they could now travel between Toronto and back in the same day. Prior to this, travel into Toronto was a full-day affair that would start with a lengthy buggy ride either to Aurora or Kleinburg to get to the nearest railway station. On August 1, 1904, the Metropolitan Railway Company and the Schomberg and Aurora Railway would be purchased by Sir William Mackenzie and folded into his new Toronto and York Radial Railway, which also included the Toronto and Mimico Electric Railway and the Toronto and Scarborough Electric Railway. William Mackenzie was a railroad tycoon in every sense of the word, having spent time working with CP Rail before establishing his own railway company, the Canadian Northern Railway, the precursor to today's CN Rail. Here he would make his fortune and further his ambitions by convincing the city of Toronto to hand over streetcar operations to his Toronto Railway Company in 1891. In 1892, he and a colleague would gain the right to run a streetcar service in Winnipeg, establishing the Winnipeg Electric Street Railway. The T&YRR would be the final feather in his cap as he was now in control of a large freight railway operator, 2 municipal streetcar systems, a small passenger railway, and 3 interurban lines totaling 1/4 of Canada's total interurban trackage. Mackenzie's main order of business was to extend his new interurban lines, with the Metropolitan receiving a massive 40-kilometer extension along the shores of Lake Simcoe to Jackson's Point. However, unlike prior extensions, this one would be different, as after leaving Newmarket, the line would run on its own private right-of-way. Speed was the name of the game for this extension, and interurban cars would no longer have to contend with vehicular traffic. Mackenzie would spare no expense for this extension. This extension would run on a 20-meter wide right-of-way at a cost of $1,000 per kilometer. Cars would run on 10-meter long 27-kilogram rails that rested on strong cedar ties resting on 30 centimeters of ballast. Outside of Newmarket, the maximum gradient was 1.5%, and only 2 curves on the route exceeded a turning radius of 2 degrees. As for the route itself, after leaving Newmarket Station, the line would briefly travel north along Reagan Street before turning east onto Queen Street. From there, it would cross the Grand Trunk Railway tracks and turn north onto its own right-of-way. The right-of-way would meander through the countryside before ending at Metro Road South. From there, the route would follow Metro Road to Jackson's Point Station at Dalton Road. Additional stops would be located at Keynes, Davis, North Newmarket, Sharon's, Doanes, Queensville, Holborns, Bogues, Cowissons, Ravenshoe, Peters Corners, Keswick, Orchard Beach, Boyers, Rose's Point, Hamilton's, Brighton Beach, Varney Road, Eastbourne, Island Road, Trivets, Winches, and Sunnyside. Lastly, a new power station would be built just east of Sunnyside to help power this extension. The first cars to Jackson's Point would roll into town on June 1st, 1907, and the extension was an immediate success. For the first time, the shores of Lake Simcoe were now within reach to the average Torontonian, and they would make use of this. The summer season was a particularly successful time for this part of the route. If places like Richmond Hill and Aurora were to become the new suburbs of Toronto, then the shores of Lake Simcoe were now bound to become the new cottage country for Toronto. Prior to this, a trip to Lake Simcoe was an excruciating day-long affair that only the wealthiest and most foolhardy would bear, but now a person need only take the train to get to their cottage by the lake. However, it wasn't just the route itself that was built with no cost spared. The T&YRR would also purchase a brand new fleet of 15 new dark green trolley cars to run this service to Lake Simcoe. These new cars would be made of solid steel with separate smoking and non-smoking compartments, as well as lavatory and water fountain facilities. The interiors would be lined with oak paneling, leaded glass windows, and high rattan-covered seats. Canadian Railway and Marine World would state that these new cars had all of the comforts and convenience of the modern railway coach and are probably the finest cars of their kind yet to be put into commission in Canada. Not everyone was convinced at first, however. Years later, a resident would state to the Toronto Star that farmers imagined the Radial would bring a lot of bums to steal produce. They also thought the Radial would lower the land value of their farms. One man stood at his fence with a gun and dared them to go through his cornfield, and they didn't do it. A widow in North Gwillimbury took her team at night and drew out the poles they had planted during the day. However, many of these opponents would eventually be won over, with one such person stating, "The Radial was a blessing and we didn't know it. The farms increased in value and the farmers were the ones to become convinced of the value of the Radials." One man who opposed it was the owner of swampy land. This land became valuable and he made well from it. During the summers, the T&YRR would run 7 daily trips from Toronto to Lake Simcoe, and suddenly this once sleepy part of Ontario was jolted to life. Farmers now had easy access to the market in Newmarket. Teenagers from Keswick would now ride the train to Newmarket High School, and Torontonians would flock to the area in the summer, buying up land and building new cottages along the lake. Ridership would be steady through the summer, with it spiking during the civic holiday and Labor Day weekends. Employee of the TNYRR Charles Wilson would state, "The record I have is over the civic holiday in August 1918 when we handled a total of 3,818 passengers." In 1908, the TNYRR would open a brand new car house and shops facilities at the intersection of Yonge and St. Clair. This facility would be expanded in 1910. 1 year later, on January 1st, 1909, the Metropolitan line would receive its final extension as the route was extended 2 kilometers south on Dalton Street to a station in Sutton at the intersection of Dalton Street and High Street. The travel time between Toronto and Sutton was estimated to be around 2 hours and 45 minutes. However, while things were booming in the north, resentment towards the interurban began to brew in the south. Through cars, freight cars, and summer excursion cars had begun clogging the streets of Toronto and North Toronto, interfering with horse and automobile traffic, as well as slowing down passenger service to Glen Grove. Both Toronto City Council and North Toronto Town Council had grown antagonistic towards the Toronto and York, while the TNYRR would blame civic politicians for not allowing them to double-track the line. Throughout all of this expansion and success, there was still a big unresolved issue with the Metropolitan line. It and really all of Toronto's interurbans did not enter the city proper. Riders were forced to transfer between the interurbans and local streetcar service. There was no one-seat ride from the suburbs to downtown. This was in stark contrast to cities like Hamilton, Vancouver, Montreal, and cities across the United States, which had interurban lines penetrating right into the heart of their cities. The blame for this lay largely with the city of Toronto, which had been debating what to do with the interurban line since 1899. The city would set up a committee to look into the interurbans running into Toronto proper, and by 1901 had an agreement ready. The issue was that the city inserted so many provisions into this agreement that none of the suburban rail operators would agree to it. This was also the closest the city would get to allowing the interurbans into Toronto, as after this agreement was rejected, a 20-year-long saga would commence. One of the biggest questions was, if the interurbans were led into the city, where would they run? Would they street run alongside the streetcars, or would they run on their own private right-of-ways? In the former case, would it be worth street running the interurbans on streets that were already clogged with streetcar and vehicular traffic? That seems like it would just slow everyone down even more. If the lines ran in private right-of-ways, where would they be built and who would own them? What track gauge would they use, standard or the streetcar gauge? And should running rights be granted on a short-term or long-term basis? Everyone would get in on this debate, with the Toronto Board of Trade painting a grand picture of interurbans following the pre-existing train lines to the waterfront and then running on streetcar tracks to the St. Lawrence Market. In May of 1905, a delegation of politicians from York, Halton, and Peel counties would go to the Premier of Ontario, James Whitney, and urge him to introduce legislation allowing the interurbans into Toronto. The Conservative MPP for North York, T.H. Lennox, would state that this was needed so that persons need not transfer or produce be changed from radial to city lines in order to reach Market, the waterfront, or Union Station. Representatives from Toronto would state that they would not make agreements binding it beyond 1921, the year that the Toronto Railway Company's operating charter was set to expire. This is where we get into the city's growing resentment of Sir William Mackenzie, who, if you will recall, happens to own the Toronto Railway Company, which owned and operated the city's streetcar network, as well as the Toronto and York Radial Railway, which owned and operated the Metropolitan Line, the Mimico Line, the Scarborough Line, and the Schomberg Railway. This matter would only be worsened when Mackenzie bought a controlling stake in the Toronto Suburban Railway in 1911, thus giving him control of every interurban around Toronto, as well as control of the local streetcar network in West Toronto. He in effect had built a monopoly on public transit in Toronto. If that wasn't enough, he also had a stake in the Toronto Electric Light Company, which was one of the main electricity providers for the city. To say that Mackenzie was omnipresent in Toronto is an understatement. As the 1900s moved on, it became increasingly clear that the city wanted nothing to do with Mackenzie and was willing to just wait out the TRC's and Toronto and York's operating charters and then take control of the city's streetcar network. Mackenzie, for his part, wasn't doing too hot either, as his Canadian Northern Railway was starting to lose money, as Canada simply didn't have the market for two transcontinental railways at the time. Eventually, this would lead to the federal government taking over the Canadian Northern and Grand Trunk Railways, turning them into Canadian National, or CN Rail. However, the city's continued blocking of any kind of deal with the suburban railways wasn't just about being anti-Mackenzie. In 1911, the city was looking at the possibility of constructing streetcar subways under Yonge Street and Bloor and Danforth, with the interurbans terminating at the end of those lines. In 1913, Mackenzie approached the city offering to sell them the Toronto Railway Company and portions of the Toronto and York that operated within municipal boundaries, and his stake in the Toronto Electric Light Company. Then Mayor of Toronto Horatio Halton jumped at this chance to get rid of Mackenzie 8 years early and signed a tentative agreement. In this agreement, the city would purchase the Toronto Railway Company and portions of the Toronto and York for $22 million. The city would also pay an additional $8 million for the Toronto Electric Light Company. This agreement would fall through though, however, due to the outbreak of World War I and the election of Tommy Church as mayor in 1915. World War I made it impossible for the city to make any real long-term financial commitments, and Tommy Church was quite possibly Sir William Mackenzie's biggest hater. Church would block any attempt at resolving the interurban question and tore up the tentative agreement as he believed its terms were too favorable to Mackenzie. According to historian Michael Duquette, Church was determined to expose once and for all the inadequate service provided by the Mackenzie Man traction companies. Behind the personalities, there was also a political angle to all of this, as Church had connections to the Conservative Party while Mackenzie was connected to the Liberals. Ultimately, the only solution to this impasse was either Tommy Church leaving office or Mackenzie's operating charters expiring. This would all come to a head on the night of Friday, June 25, 1915. That night, a team of city workers carrying pickaxes, shovels, and other such tools gathered at the intersection of Avenue Road and Farnham Avenue. The group then began to move east as a crowd of onlookers began to gather at Yonge Street. Mayor Tommy Church and Works Commissioner R.C. Harris arrive at the intersection of Yonge and Farnham. Along with them are lawyers from the city's solicitor department and Patrol Sergeant Hutchinson with half a dozen police officers. Charles Wilson, the manager of the Toronto and York Radial Railway, also arrives and converses with Harris. At 11:58 p.m., the last Metropolitan car runs north, passing through the intersection. Prior to this night, the city had annexed the town of North Toronto in 1912. The Toronto and York had maintained running rights on this section of the line even though it was now within the city's boundaries. In 2 minutes, the Toronto and York's running rights within the city of Toronto will expire. At midnight, as a church bell rings out, the workers begin hammering away at the tracks and before long have torn out the first section of rail. The city of Toronto was tearing up the tracks between Farnham Avenue and the CP rail tracks. Mayor Church would exclaim to the crowd of onlookers, "We decided this policy a month ago. These people have not acted fair by the city. They have never made an effort to meet the city and try to arrange anything. They waited until the last moment, but now no agreement can be made without the sanction of the people." This, of course, is a load of crap. Tommy Church never had any intention of playing fair and simply wanted Mackenzie and his railway empire gone from the city. Church blocked any attempt at finding a solution to the issue, even when the Toronto and York proposed moving their tracks off to the side of Yonge Street. The residents of North Toronto did not complain much about what had happened, as they too had been growing frustrated with the Metropolitan line. As the town grew, so did passenger traffic, and this was coming into conflict with the immense freight traffic the Toronto and York was moving. By 1912, one could see up to 100 boxcars per day running up and down this section of Yonge Street, and all of this was competing for space with passenger cars, vehicular traffic, and private buggies. Solutions to this issue were put forward, such as adding more passing switches, double tracking the line, restricting freight traffic to off-peak hours, moving the tracks off of Yonge Street on the busy southern section of the route, constructing a turn-back loop at the CP rail tracks to reduce turnaround time, and joining the Toronto and York railway tracks with the streetcar tracks. Company officials and politicians, however, could not agree on what to do, and meetings just devolved into arguments. Residents of North Toronto wouldn't help the matter, as in a 1912 referendum, they would reject an offer to double-track the line in exchange for an annual rent of $1,200 for the right-of-way, a fare of 10 tickets for 25 cents during rush hour, and a 5-minute service. When the sun rose on June 16th, there was now a 5-block, 400-meter gap between the Metropolitan's new terminus at Farnham Avenue and the pre-existing terminus of the Yonge streetcar at Price Street. A black market of unauthorized and unlicensed jitneys would spring up along this small stretch of Yonge Street to ferry commuters across the 400-meter gap to transfer between the routes. In the background, the City of Toronto and the Toronto Railway Company would argue over who would be responsible for filling this gap in service. Ultimately, the Ontario Railway and Municipal Board would compel the TRC to construct new tracks on Yonge Street, and the Yonge streetcar would be extended to Woodlawn Avenue. This didn't completely fill the gap though, as there was still a 1-block gap between Woodlawn and Farnham Avenues. While all of this was going on, up north in 1916, the Toronto and York would electrify the Schomberg and Aurora Railway, turning it into a true interurban line. Some cars would now run through to Toronto via the Metropolitan line, but most terminated at Bond Lake. The S&AR at this point was also generating around 300 cars of freight annually. Back in Toronto, Tommy Church would continue his crusade to, in his own words, clean the Metropolitan off of Yonge Street, but cooler heads would begin to prevail. The Toronto Railway Company's charter was set to expire in 1921, and the city would hold a series of referendums over what to do next. Local ratepayers would approve of the city's planned takeover of the TRC, as well as the purchase of the Toronto and York Radial Railway. These two services, along with the Toronto Civic Railway, would be merged together to form the new municipally owned Toronto Transportation Commission, or TTC. In 1921, the operating charters for the Toronto Railway Company and the Toronto and York Radial Railway would expire, and Sir William Mackenzie's influence was largely gone from the city. The city would enter into an agreement with Ontario Hydro that would see the city retain control of the Toronto and York's tracks, now within the city's boundaries, while those outside would go to Ontario Hydro. Specifically, Ontario Hydro would operate and manage the interurbans outside of Toronto, while the city would retain ownership and be responsible for capital expenditures and operating deficits. How Ontario Hydro got roped into all of this is a story for another video, as this one is long enough as it is. Ontario Hydro had grand plans for the Metropolitan line, including the introduction of new high-speed, lightweight passenger cars, constructing additional passing sidings for more frequent service, construction of a new freight terminal in downtown Toronto, moving small freight shipments off of the rails and onto small motorized trucks, and lastly improving stations and waiting sheds. All of this was estimated to cost $1.1 million. That's about $17.6 million today. The city, however, would only approve of $650,000 in spending for the line. That's about $10.4 million today. This money would be used for track realignments, resurfacing roadbeds, construction of new passing loops, more waiting shelters, and a new station at Schomberg Junction. As well, service to Thornhill and Bond Lake was increased. March 1923 would see the new Glen Echo Loop open as a joint-use facility between the Metropolitan Line and the TTC's Young Streetcar. In 1923, the Metropolitan Line carried 1,969,800 passengers, although this number would slowly drop in the following years. Ridership across the Ontario Hydro network was dropping despite the rapid population growth of the areas it served. Fewer people were riding the Radials as alternatives became available, such as better conventional train service, buses, and soon car ownership. Ontario Hydro was losing money with a deficit of $204,505 in 1923. That's about $3.6 million today. This deficit would grow and would reach $253,575 3 years later. That's about $4.5 million today. The city would blame this on mismanagement, while Ontario Hydro would blame the TTC as they had taken control of all of the profitable sections of the route, leaving Ontario Hydro with the least profitable section. Either way, the city would decide that the best course of action would be to absorb the interurban lines into the TTC proper. This would occur on January 12, 1927 at a handover ceremony at Glen Echo Loop. The TTC was now in control of the second largest publicly owned electric railway network in North America, totaling 585 kilometers of track, second only to Detroit. Not only did the TTC control its vast streetcar system in Toronto, but it now had the Metropolitan Line, the Schomberg and Aurora Railway, the Mimico Line, and the Scarborough Line. However, service on the Schomberg and Aurora would not last much longer as it was simply unprofitable. Between 1923 and 1926, the operating expenses of the line was about $26,000 per year. It's about $461,000 today. Yet revenue had been steadily dropping from $31,325 in 1923, $556,000 today, to just $17,997 in 1926. It's about $319,000 today. Service on the S&AR would end on June 20th, 1927. There were attempts by residents in Schomberg to restart service on the railway, but this was to no avail. The tracks would be torn up the next year. The TTC would move quickly to streamline service on the Metropolitan Line, which it had renamed to Lake Simcoe. The TTC would apply to City Council for $430,000, it's about $7.8 million, to upgrade service on the line, including track reconstruction, construction of a turnback loop at Bond Lake, remodeling of express and service cars, and the purchase of 14 new passenger cars. In September of 1927, the TTC would re-gauge the entire Lake Simcoe line from Glen Echo Loop to Sutton, from standard gauge to the TTC's streetcar gauge. They would also re-gauge all of the cars that operate along the Lake Simcoe route. More impressively is that the TTC pulled off this monstrous task in just 6 days. Between September 11th and 17th, the TTC would re-gauge the entire Lake Simcoe line at a rate of 1.5 kilometers of track an hour, while the route's entire fleet of cars was re-gauged at the shops. Due to this, the Lake Simcoe line could now run a through service all the way into downtown Toronto, although the TTC never really made much use of this outside of some nighttime express runs and summer excursion cars. It's not as if the TTC didn't have plans to run a through service though, as they had acquired property at the intersection of Wellington and Front Streets for the construction of a new interurban terminal with an opening planned for 1928. However, by the end of 1927, the TTC had a change of heart and dropped the plan for a new downtown terminal and new cars for the route. The reason for this was, even with the improvements the TTC had made, the Lake Simcoe line had still lost around $97,000. That's about $1.7 million today. The TTC at this point was ready to end service on Toronto's remaining interurban lines. Canadian Railway and Marine World would state, "The line had been losing money for years and continues to do so. It would not be surprising if within a year it is decided to abandon the greater part of it, retaining only the southerly few miles immediately north of the Toronto city limits." The decline of Toronto's interurbans came rapidly as personal automobiles became more accessible and buses offered transit access to places the interurbans did not go. The TTC would take note of the rapid expansion of bus companies around Toronto and would begin buying up bus operators and consolidating them into the TTC-owned grey coach lines. Relevant to this video, the TTC would purchase Metropolitan bus lines in 1928, which operated a coach service to Barrie and Orillia. By February 11, 1929, Grey Coach was operating 4 round trips per day to Newmarket, with an additional 3 trips to Barrie and Orillia via Newmarket. This had an immediate effect on the Lake Simcoe line as service to Newmarket was reduced from 21 daily trips to just 10. One of the things that set buses above the interurbans was their ability to run directly into downtown Toronto, something the interurbans still did not do. In 1931, the TTC would announce the construction of a new $200,000 bus terminal at Bay and Edward Streets, as the old one had reached capacity, with upwards of 130 buses and 2,500 passengers passing through it each day. By December 1932, some 1.25 million passengers rode out of Toronto on 93 separate bus runs totaling 870 kilometers of routes radiating out from the city. The interurbans simply could not compete with this. The age of interurbans in Toronto was over. The TTC was already planning on ending service on the Lake Simcoe line back in 1929, but this drew a lot of protests from the communities along the route. The TTC would offer to lease the line to York County for $1 a year, as long as York County assumed all of the operating expenses of the route. York County would turn down this offer. Ultimately, service on the Lake Simcoe line would end at 1:15 a.m. on March 16, 1930. Everything would be sold, from the cars to the stations. The tracks and catenary north of Newmarket would be torn up in June of 1931. However, this was not truly the end. As abandonment approached, in March of 1930, municipal authorities worked to come up with a replacement service for the communities north of Toronto. Initially, buses replaced interurban service, but the village of York Mills objected to buses running along Yonge Boulevard, and residents further up Yonge Street complained of bus-induced traffic. On March 14th, just 2 days before the line was set to be abandoned, North York Township entered into discussions with the city and TTC about purchasing or leasing the southernmost 7.5 kilometers of the route. The village of Richmond Hill and the townships of Markham and Vaughan would also be interested. On May 15th, these 4 municipalities would put the question of purchasing the line to a referendum, which passed with 1,336 for and 110 against. Newmarket would join in, trying to save the 20 kilometers of the line between Richmond Hill and Newmarket. Eventually, the idea grew to saving the entire route to Sutton. However, it became clear that the route north of Richmond Hill would produce nothing but growing deficits. Ultimately, the route north of Richmond Hill would remain abandoned, while the 4 municipalities of North York, Richmond Hill, Markham, and Vaughan would proceed with their purchase of the line for $66,500. It's $1.1 million today. With this, the North Yonge Railway would be established. Operations of the route would be contracted out to the TTC, who would receive 10% of gross receipts to cover the administrative costs. Deficits and surpluses would be divided evenly among the participating municipalities. Lastly, neither the TTC nor any municipality along the route would operate or license a competing bus service. On July 17, 1930, radial cars began trundling along Yonge Street again between Glen Echo Loop and Lorne Avenue in Richmond Hill. This service would be called the North Yonge Line. Base service along the route was once every half hour to Steeles and every hour to Richmond Hill. This would be doubled during peak periods. Fares were 5 cents per zone, with a single trip to Richmond Hill costing 30 cents. That's $5.33 today. Round-trip tickets cost 55 cents. That's $9.77 today. The route would use cars from the now closed Mimico line, as the TTC had sold all of the old Metropolitan cars. The TTC would invest in track and catenary improvements, a new signaling system, and a new electrical substation in Willowdale. They would also purchase land in Richmond Hill for a potential turnback loop, eyeing the possibility of using single-ended cars on the route. The North Yonge line would be a success, with an annual ridership between 800,000 and 900,000 passengers in the early 1930s. During the Depression years, the route would run a deficit, but starting in 1937, it began turning a profit. The onset of World War II would see ridership skyrocket as people commuted into the city for work and rubber and gas were rationed. Ridership would consistently reach 2 million riders per year during the war, peaking at 2,348,896 riders in 1946. The route would also turn a profit of $59,866 that year. That's about $1.06 million today. By 1947, service on the North Yonge line was 3 times an hour to Steeles, every half hour to Thornhill, and once an hour to Richmond Hill. The North Yonge line was a smashing success. However, World War II would not only bring the route to its highest highs, but it would ultimately be its undoing. Unfortunately, when the war was over, the TTC did not have the money to upgrade the now ancient cars running on the line, nor the money or resources to fix and upgrade the tracks. Ridership had continued to increase, which forced the TTC to operate supplemental bus service along Yonge Street as far north as Finch Avenue. On October 10, 1948, service on the North Yonge line would be suspended for a 6-month period due to power shortages in North York. The cars, however, would never return. The Upper Canada Railway Society would state in its newsletter, "Although ostensibly a power-saving move for North York Township, suspicions are rife with this being merely an excuse for removing the cars with the idea that they will never go back again, thanks to the conniving of certain persons of groups interested in seeing buses on the route permanently. This includes the Department of Highways, which wants to snatch the track allowance for pavement widening." At the end of the 6-month suspension, no call went up from North Yonge car riders for its return. The North York Township had gone to businesses along the route to convince them that buses were the most cost-efficient vehicle for Yonge Street's future. Ratepayers in North York would vote 4-1 in favor of permanent bus service along Yonge Street. Service on the North Yonge Railway was now officially dead, and Canada's first interurban and Toronto's last was gone for good. The tracks to Richmond Hill would be torn up in 1950 and all but one car scrapped. Only car 416 survives, having been sent to the Halton County Radial Railway Museum. It's hard to overstate the impact the Metropolitan line had on not just Toronto, but the communities along the Yonge Street corridor. It took what were once sleeping rural communities and turned them into bustling towns and suburbs. The Metropolitan line laid the foundation for the Yonge Street we know today. What were once barren dirt roads became major streets lined on either side with shops and places to live. It opened new economic opportunities for places like Richmond Hill, Aurora, and Newmarket, allowing people to commute into the city. Its freight operations allowed produce and other products made in these far-flung communities to reach a wider market in the city, enriching farmers who now had easier access to markets and business owners who could now import products quicker and cheaper. It connected the city to Lake Simcoe, allowing people around Toronto access to a part of the province that before was a mere pipe dream. People flocked to the lake, purchasing land and establishing summer cottages that still exist to this day. And yet, for all of its success, it would always be hamstrung by the fact it could never find its way into downtown Toronto. It was always hamstrung by its single-track nature. It was a route that had more to give, but the powers that be at the time could not see the forest through the trees. It is hard to say if the Metropolitan would have survived the dominance of car culture if everything went right, because very few interurbans in North America survived this. That said, it needs to be asked how a route that was moving 2 million passengers a year and turning a healthy profit consistently could just disappear off city streets. While the section of the route north of Richmond Hill may have been a money pit, we know for a fact everything south was profitable. While I don't want to get into conspiracy theories, to me there is something funky going on here, and the North Yonge line should not have been shut down when it was. While the Metropolitan is gone, its legacy is alive and well, not just in what we see along Yonge Street above ground, but also which lay beneath it, the Yonge subway. Only 5 years after the North Yonge line closed, the city would open its first subway under Yonge Street, running from Union Station to Eglinton. While the subway was built to ostensibly replace the Yonge streetcar, what the Yonge streetcar served north of the CP rail tracks was built by the Metropolitan line. By the end of the 1970s, the subway had made its way to Finch Avenue, bringing fast and convenient rail service back to North York. Now, however, riders would finally get the one-seat ride into downtown they had always wanted. As the years go on, more of what once was returns, as the province constructs a further extension of the Yonge subway into Richmond Hill, restoring the service formerly provided by the now long-forgotten North Yonge Railway. York Region would also establish its Viva Blue BRT line along Yonge Street, connecting the city of Toronto to Newmarket. Today, you can still find a couple buildings of the Metropolitan line. These include the old Queensville Station House, which has since been moved and is now a private residence, Keswick Station House, which is now a law office, the Willow Beach Substation, which is now a private residence, the waiting shelters for Trivets and Winches stops, which are now on display at the Georgina Pioneer Village and Archives, the Sutton Station House, which is now an office building. Lastly, in Newmarket you can see a concrete arch that once supported a bridge carrying the route across the Holland River and Grand Trunk railway tracks. You can still see a part of its old right-of-way north of Newmarket, as well as the large sweeping curves of Metro Road in Georgina. Finally, as stated earlier in the video, car 416 of the North Yonge line is preserved at the Halton County Radial Railway Museum. Very little remains of the old Schomberg and Aurora Railway, save for a small hint of its own right-of-way at Yonge and Bond Street in Richmond Hill. You can also still see the old Schomberg Station House in Schomberg at the intersection of Dr. K Drive and Main Street. While the physical route is gone, the Metropolitan line's effect on the city and the Greater Toronto area can still be seen, even as we seemingly slowly put the route back together, just in a different form. And with that, I will end this video here. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please hit that subscribe button because there are more videos like it on the channel, and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Metropolitan line or its compatriot, the Schomberg and Aurora Railway, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.